the talk today is called Yesterday, Today, and Tomorrow. Basically, how HCD has evolved and how it does and doesn't play well with Agile. I'm Brad Lehman. I'm an HCD practice lead. I've been a consultant at a few different companies with a few different practices. I'm the author of a book that is going to be published in the winter or spring called Human-Centered Agile. I'm also a DJ on the air at Tacoma Park, Maryland. So if you go to tacomaradio.org, you can hear me talk about very much not UX and HCD kinds of things. We play music that is meant to calm you in our chaotic world. One quick thing is that you'll notice I say HCD parentheses UX and Agile. I don't think there is anything particularly wrong with the term UX, and I have never been one to really fight over terminology, but lately I have come to feel that UX is a little bit degraded as a term, in the sense that people already have a mental model of what it is, and it's a very cramped mental model. So I like the term HCD, Human-Centered Design, because it just reminds people that there is, in fact, there are humans in this process and you need to talk to them. UX should do the same thing, just has gotten a little stale, frankly. Oops. All right. So this talk is called Yesterday, Today, and Tomorrow. And I wanted to talk really quickly about why we start with yesterday. As UXers, you probably already know you want to go in and do your research. You want to understand how decisions and everything get made. But a lot of people, and especially since we're having an influx of a lot of young talent into our field, a lot of new user experience professionals into our field, it's really important to remind everyone. I use the Chesterton quote here, before you remove the fence, you have to know why it was put there. When considering how Agile and UX work together, you really have to think about, or start with, what problems got solved before you start trying to reinvent it or reimagine it or make it better. Why is that fence there? Why is this process the way it is? All right, HCD is old. I put Design of Everyday Things here. I could have put, Jacob Nielsen's book, or Lou Rosenfeld's book, or any other book from, sort of the dawn of HCD. But I prefer to think about design and HCD from other sources that are actually a little older. These two books at the top, Atul Gawande's Better and David Byrne's How Music Works, probably have influenced me more in my design than just about any other professional books have. Atul Gawande covers the gamut of UX related things. He talks about adoption and the way things change and I can't oversell this. There's chapters on how Semmelweis introduced and had to fight for repeatedly to get hand washing as part of the medical practice. He talks about bringing vaccines, and this book was written a while ago, so he's not talking about COVID vaccines, but he's talking about bringing vaccines out to communities that aren't really ready for them, and how to meet your constituents, your customers, where they are, and understand the cultural gaps between you and them in a way that makes sense. He talks about Virginia Apgar and how, scoring and measuring your outcomes really impacts the way that the process works and what the concerns are. David Byrne talks about how the stage, the place where something is created, how much it affects what gets created. Creative process is adaptive to the environment it's created in. And as I think about Agile and UX, this is a really important concept for me. I have less to say about Ogilvy on advertising, just to remind that, these ideas, a lot of the ideas that we think about have been out there in some other form in, related fields for a while. And then, of course, let's see if I can get this to play. HCD is new. We are in a time when there are shorter delivery cycles, and we end up feeling like we are just hanging on the treadmill. Even in software delivery, through the 90s and early 2000s, software was delivered on a physical medium, which meant that there was a long development and, infrequent release cycle. That's not the case anymore. And the way that has changed changes us, and it changes what we do. As a designer, and I'm sure I imagine this is relatable, I still sometimes add some HCD to this. Can you just design this up a little? Look and feel, pixel pushing, whatever terminology people use. I like to use this graphic on the right. I've shown product owners and program managers, when you say HCD, and this is not exhaustive, but actually a wide array of disciplines that come into doing HCD. And no, we really can't just add some HCD to something, especially when, you've made decisions that are difficult to get past. And checking real quick on time, see how we're doing. All right. And finally, it can feel frustrating sometimes. I've talked to a lot of designers that are frustrated with what their role is in the process, how things can take a long time to change and adapt. Change takes time. One of my favorite pieces of design is the safety gate in a fire stairwell. I don't know if you've ever noticed them. It's so simple, it's so basic. Back in the old days, we had these rickety old fire escapes that would hang off the side of buildings. They would sometimes collapse. I mean, you can look at them and just know that they are much safer than not having them, and still leave a lot of room for improvement. It took a long time before we got to this little gate that in a building, the fire escape is basically usually now the stairwell. It's almost a fully separate building. And what they did is they realized that if you let someone run down a stairwell in a fire, they will just go to the bottom. So you have a gate that basically only opens in one direction. If people are rushing out, you would have to intentionally push your way through this to go past your ground floor. It's lovely, it's basic, it's safe, it keeps people safe. It's just one of my favorite pieces of design in your everyday life. All right, so now we are getting to what it was like for me before Agile. We had these endless requirements gathering cycles. I was on one project where I was working on the requirements for 2 years. By the time developers got them, the requirements were incredibly overbaked, and some of the technology had moved on. Some of the assumptions, which were true when we started working, were no longer true by the time it was time to develop. And then we had a lot of over the transom handoffs where we would thud a requirements document and a wireframe and a whole bunch of shell statements. And I cannot tell you how many things I worked on that just didn't get built. Developers would get stuck in loops. It was a mess, and I am not joking. I'm not exaggerating when I say I almost quit design. I almost could not hang with my own profession just because of how badly the process of building this stuff was broken. That changed when I joined a 10-person team that was a rescue effort on essentially the kind of project I had been working on before. It was a rescue effort for a very big design up front, lots of requirements gathering, nothing actually got delivered. And the product owner, actually the program manager, basically kicked out the previous team, had about 6 months of budget left, and said, we are going to try to make something. We're going to get as far as we get with this new Agile thing that's happening. It was itself an experiment. It was a very, very collaborative experiment. And one of the things that this taught me really early on that people tend to forget about is that Agile is not a delivery process. It's an improvement process. The whole point of it is to take something and continually improve on it. It doesn't matter if it's software. I saw there was a question in the chat. It doesn't matter if it's software. What it matters is that you are actually trying to organically get better as you go. And we had some really good shared values in terms of just in terms of how they thought about Agile and how I thought about design. What I've come to realize is that I was integrating Agile and HCD back then on easy mode. I had all these advantages baked into the fact that we were a 10-person team. We collaborated all the time. Our product owner was right there. They were really actually committed to Agile, like in a philosophical and cultural way, not just trying to shove their existing process into the Agile dictionary. And they were willing to let me go talk to users as much as I wanted. It was great. My biggest challenge was the fact that they brought me on because they could tell they were building something that did all the functionality, but didn't resonate, wasn't understandable. It was actually kind of a mess with users. So they brought me in. They thought it was going to be a 1-month engagement. I was there for another 1.5 years because there was so much work to do. And once they saw that, like, they actually had to think about how people were interfacing with their tool, not just what their tool was supposed to do, I became part of the team. It was wonderful. The things that I loved about it, we were talking in user stories, not in shall statements, which was a revolution to me. I was embedded on a team, so we didn't hand things off, we talked about them. And when someone got stuck, if a developer got stuck, they would tap me on the shoulder and say, hey, you said to do this, but I can't. And we would talk about what the next thing to do was. Those stuck loops where a developer was 80% done for, most of the time that they were working on something and it just never got to the end, those went away. Those just evaporated instantly. And then we had retrospectives. We improved as we went. So we were shipping software that worked for users, that responded to user feedback with engaged product owners. I felt great. This was like a high point that in some ways, it's fair to say, I have used as what I chase and my North Star for my career. And I didn't know this at the time, but this was also my first experience with outcome-driven design, where, the people that I was working with, if you said they were delivering more, they could not have cared. What they really cared about was, are users going to use it? Are they going to use it well? Is it going to save people, time? And I have a whole other thing about, like, this was the biggest design challenge I ever solved as well. But it was very outcome minded all the way through. So this was me in 2012 after my first Agile experience. That feeling didn't last. It turns out that not every team is like that. Not every project and program is like that. And trying to align the interests can have a lot of pitfalls. So I went through the problems that Agile solved, at least for me. Here are the problems that Agile did not solve. As I've moved, across projects, across companies, these are the things that tend to be true. Not enough time in the problem space. The whole philosophy of, not philosophy, I want to say it's attitude, because the philosophy of Agile actually does sort of let you into the problem space. The attitude around it does not always. So, it's great that you have a user story. How quickly are we getting it out the door? I have an idea, let's build it and see. I have a little fragment of a sentence. General design adoption, like the practices of HCD are not really built into Agile very well at all. Especially when you think about discovery. And I've had probably, hundreds of versions of the conversation of, if you're doing discovery, isn't that just big design up front again? Which it is not, but it takes a while to get people around to that. Like, you can't just design everything in a sprint 0 and have that be that, or just throw out your first best idea and hope that it works. Because Agile has short work cycles, HCD, both wireframes, essentially interaction design, and user testing, usability testing, tend to get commoditized a little bit, and people are trying to check the box and get to the next thing rather than do something, learn something, and then synthesize that into something better. And you see this all the time. This is an attitude problem that follows Agile around, is iteration versus incrementation. We're supposed to iterate. A lot of product owners and a lot of project managers, depending on how things are structured, to them, they just stick to incrementation, and you end up making a lot of sort of race to the bottom kind of compromises to get things out the door. And that's what you have. The outcomes are, we'll do discovery in sprint 0. Here, you have 2 weeks to learn and design and also try to validate your concept. We have to get this out the door. Designers, we get overtasked, we get stressed out, we get feeling like our work, the thing that we train to do is not the thing that we're doing. We're doing like a very small subset of that. And things get fractured. There's poor consistency. There is that race to the bottom. So why does this happen? Largely, it's because here are my hypotheses. Besides the fact that design maturity, bringing HCD into an organization does not overall have the same kind of adoption that I've seen with Agile. And maybe this is just the world that the waters that I've swum in, but it hasn't. So we are trying to bend our processes to someone else's method more than the other way around, a lot more than the other way around. Agile really prioritizes and spends time the way that it's practiced in the solution space. We're going to deliver this. We're going to, what's your burn down? What's your sizing? What are your ACs? It's all kind of solution. And then as you scale up, this is my experience, but as you scale up at a product level, you'll get a PO that's engaged and willing to take on Agile. When you get to a program level, you get to a person that is squeezed between their executives, who are all sort of still thinking in a rigorous predictability, schedule-driven way. They're not thinking with the flexibility that Agile requires, and the team that is trying to sometimes demand that flexibility that Agile is supposed to have. And you have program or portfolio managers in the middle that basically are just trying to mediate these two things. And I've known these people and seen them, and the stress of, yes, I know we're supposed to do it this way, but also, the executive said we need that. Sometimes I wonder how they don't have ulcers. A thing that is really hard to tell an executive and get them to buy in on is, we productively learn not to build something, which in Agile should be about the most valuable thing you can do. I just saved you, an arm and a leg of delivering something that no one's going to want. That is a massive return on investment. It's never seen that way. It's just never seen that way. I had one product that I worked on, which was a mobile app, and it was for agents. And what happened there, we took a product that was a desktop app at the time, and we wanted to go mobile with it. And the big idea that everyone had, all of the thinkers and the executives and the people that were trying to sort of push the ideas downhill, was that agents would use their phone, capture all kinds of data, and it would come in as much more structured data. It would be, it'd be great for the people that are trying to consume that information. And so I went out and I talked to people. And the first thing every single one of them did was open up their notebook, take their pen, and start writing. I could literally say, here's what you can do with this great app that we're planning to develop. And they would write things that we might be able to do with this app. And it just became so clear that they did not have a problem that they wanted solved at all. They had a methodology that was super comfortable, and I want to say almost like culturally driven. You were the person with the notebook, just like as HCDers, we are the people with the notebook. If someone came along and said, here's your HCD, observation app, put it on your iPad and try to use it, I wouldn't. I'm stuck to my notebook too. So scaling up, you end up with a squeezed layer, and you also end up with this place where you start reproducing old school PM techniques, things like line handoffs and pressure on predictability. So back to why this is. I don't know if you've ever heard of Conways Law. David Byrne talks about this and how music works too. What you create is always going to reflect a bias of the way that you create it. People design from their organization. Back in the early aughts, when the web was still cooling, the way that this often got expressed is companies that would make websites that essentially were their org chart. And as IAs, we had to go in and say, no one cares about your damn org chart. I see this still when it comes to help desk and support routing, where over and over again, I have to persuade clients, your users should not need to understand which department they're talking to in order to get help. It should be, from their perspective, not from your consuming perspective, but that does happen all the time. And creative work does get adapted. David Byrne talks about, how in a hall, in a big sound, you end up with choirs because you need something to fill that sound. In a small club, you end up with guitars and amps. You build for where you're going to be. Just as a little addendum, the picture here is of American Utopia, where he basically tried as hard as he could to unroot the performance from the stage. And it's a really fascinating artistic endeavor. So if you think about Conway's Law, if you keep this in mind and you look at the double diamond, it changes the way that you see it. The first time I saw the classic double diamond, there's an old joke about boat owners where the happiest day of their life is when they buy it, and the second happiest is when they sell it. The first time I saw the double diamond, I was enamored, completely enamored, because suddenly there was someone articulating the fact that there is a problem space and you need to be in it for a while, and then you move to the solution space. That's great. It's also really limiting. When you look at it this way, what you see is choke points and different interests. The double diamond leads to dual track agile, which, if you look at the left, this is every PO until they get their hands dirty long enough, they see it this way. And that picture with the discovery happening perfectly just before the delivery, etc., that kind of looks like a waterfall, doesn't it? And it really does. Like, it's very like, first you do this, then you do that. We're building predictability back in. In practice, I pulled a couple of here's what dual track agile is when you start trying to make it responsive to what you learn and create feedback loops and everything else. And it really starts to get complicated because you're trying to validate problems, you're trying to validate concepts, and then you're trying to validate a solution that is built. And it gets really uncomfortable because, we want it like what's on the right and someone else wants it to look like what's on the left. You also end up with separated concerns. The people that are sort of working in the problem space are really, they have a mindset. And this is where, like, lean UX sort of bumps up against, at least in my opinion, it bumps up against its limitations where, you're learning and you're trying to make the best thing. Then at some point, someone's going to deliver it, and they're not trying to make the best thing. They're trying to make the fastest thing. They're trying to manage their burn down chart. They're trying to, at the end of the day, the developer is going to see a problem as a development problem and lean on their most comfortable technologies, their favorite solutions. And you end up kind of fighting. I've seen this sort of bifurcation again and again, where the people in charge of thinking about why the problem is important and how to solve it want the best thing, and the people that are delivering it just want to get it out the door. And that's not a great feeling. So we're going to move away from this. This is my premise. Good decisions come from experience. Experience comes from bad decisions. The one weird trick is that they do not need to be your bad decisions. And I know there's some experienced folks in this room. We took those punches, so maybe a few people don't have to. What I want us to go to is a more holistic approach to design in Agile, where we're not thinking about it's dual track and you're handing it off and you're creating these chunks that have to learn how to talk to each other, but something a little bit more organic. And this is not exactly the topic of HCD and Agile exactly, but as designers, I really think we need to move in the direction of a more ethical approach to design. And there's nothing in Agile that precludes that by any stretch. All right, so I tried to find a really good example of holism, and I realized that I may have gone too far along the geek path with Steven Universe. But they have this concept of characters that merge and become something different. So, merging isn't scaling up. It isn't a yin and yang where you sort of both learn how to coexist. You actually create something different. And I'm hoping that what Human-Centered Agile does is create a different way of thinking about this. So you're not handing off problems. You're not like handing off a solution where one team has done an experiment. They figured, hey, this is a great solution. Let's hand it to another team to deliver it. And they're going to have to get that buy-in, or they're going to have to just sort of accept things as writ. What I really want is for every place where there's a handoff, every place where you are moving downstream, you're handing off problems, you're handing off stewardship of a challenge, not a set of tasks, not a deliverable. And this is important because one of the things that has really changed in my way of thinking from that double diamond is to the rubric that you're looking for. As HCDers, we want to make sure it's the right problem, it's the right solution, and we built it right. And setting it that way, has been really effective for me in conversations with people, because it's really easy to identify which of those things your work is aligning to in a way that is much less clear when you're talking about problem space and solution space. Or is this where we're doing discovery? Is this where we're doing, validation? Validation itself gets stuck because people don't know whether you mean ideation and concept validation from a lateral thinking stage, or whether you mean, hey, we built something and we want usability testing for it. So, when you shift a little bit into right problem, right solution, done right, a lot of those things kind of fall away. I want to also give I put the link in the deck. That language came from Jen Cardello, and I love it. So hat tip to her. And the right approach, when we talk about maturity, when we talk about scaling up, the right approach is whatever approach maximizes your shared understanding and your collaborative decision-making from one end of the process all the way through the other. So if you're having conversations that say like, the executive wanted this, but the team thinks that, you've sort of missed it. And it needs to be okay for those conversations, the right problem, right solution, done right conversations, to continue happening all the way through the process. There's a quote by Roger Ebert, who is one of my favorite writers. and this is completely unrelated, except that it's not, says the muse appears during the act of creation, not before. And I think at a team level, teams that are humming along have great ideas about alternative solutions, alternative paths, and it needs to be okay to come back and say, okay, do we still think this is the right solution? Do we still think this is the right problem? There's a way to do that without slowing everything down, which is what sort of the PO fears, is that, oh, we're going to slow things down. We're going to throw things away by just spinning our wheels. And finally, this is fundamentally a culture change. It is not, there are a lot of process changes to happen. I'm not kidding, I'm writing a book about it. Like, there are a lot of process changes, but the culture change is every bit as important when you're thinking about this. All right, a little quick pitch about design ethics, because this is where else I think we need to go. I've been at this career for a while. It was a full 20 years into my career that before ethics even surfaced as a topic for me. Before it hit my radar, like, hey, you're a designer, you're an experienced designer, you should be thinking about this. And that came with Mike Montero's talks and then Ruined by Design. And even that, like, it's a cri de coeur, it's a call to arms for thinking about it, not a recipe for doing it. The only ethics I ever really did get, and it's that narrow slice, have to do with accessibility. We have section 508 that we have to mind, and that is great, but it is a small part of it. You don't really need me to tell you what the damage done by disinformation and our terrible sort of social media environment has wrought. But I will tell a quick little story that I saw the aftermath of someone that got hit by a bus while driving one of these little bird scooters just before the pandemic. And it was gruesome. And there were a lot of decisions that stood between, someone having an idea and that person getting wiped out. And I could not tell you that I'm confident that anyone really did impact analysis. I imagine that a lot of people said, hey, it's your responsibility to keep yourself safe, which is one way to look at it. But, I think we do have a certain responsibility for the things that we put out into the world and the way that they impact people's lives. Soapbox over. What I do think, as we start to introduce a topic that is still very tentative and a little tender, is don't be afraid of being the first person to have a conversation about something. Don't be afraid to ask uncomfortable questions about the impact of what you're doing that fall outside of your immediate business concerns. I think our path as collectively as designers is going to be to build a common vocabulary, a common set of articulated interests that we're looking out for. You can see this a little bit in the book Apart books. They're starting to do this with cross-cultural design and design for safety and things like that. I think we have some good planks. I don't think we've quite built ourselves a house yet. The reason I say don't be afraid of being a first conversation is I had a C-suite executive that confessed to me one time that, it doesn't matter what the idea is. He doesn't really pay attention until it crosses his radar a third time. Basically, he needs a certain amount of social proof. And I think a lot of people work this way. This is our cognitive bias. Social proof matters. People start to get softer to ideas when they've heard them a bunch of times, and someone has to be that first conversation. So don't be afraid to do it. You might be making someone else's life a little easier later. All right, so here's the practical side as we come back to today. There's the problems that we have. There's the vision of where we want to go, which is a little bit more holistic and a little bit more ethical. Well, what does that look like for me? What has that looked like for me over my last 10 years, really? So the first is that there are some really important ingredients for success that have just proven themselves time and again with me. You need an engaged product owner. You need some kind of integration between the designer and team. You cannot have just like handoffs. You need access to users. How surprising. As we move down, these are in order of things that are hard to get. So, getting an engaged product owner, that's the low-hanging fruit of all this. Synthesis time for figuring out, okay, here's what we learned, here's what we should do about it. That can be hard. These last two have been the most elusive of all metrics that are tied to design success, so that, when you say, how do we know we did well, that the work that we're doing impacts that and is understood to impact that. And the last one, which should be easy in Agile, but is not, is permission to learn and to fail. A lot of places are really still very uncomfortable, even though the whole motto, fail fast, it's not as accepted as you might hope it would be in my experience. At a product level, I've found certain conversations work for me over and over again. The first is a really basic one. It's one of the first things that a designer gets taught, but sometimes we forget to have it anyway. But what problem are we trying to solve? What are we actually trying to accomplish here? In the heat of the day, sometimes that actually gets forgotten. I've already talked about right problem, right solution, done right, but it's been a really effective framing. The next most effective framing, what are the stakes? When you're trying to get people to buy into the idea that you need to do testing, that you need to do validation, that you need to do the kind of work that mitigates against risk, you really have to talk to them about, okay, what happens if we launch this and it flops? Let's be honest, everyone thinks they have a great idea and only some people do. And to have that from an HCD perspective as an open-ended question, because sometimes the stakes aren't that high. We don't have to test everything if we really can learn and we really can iterate, or if the stakes are just so low that, a design choice is a design choice. If you're going to launch a product and your 30 friends are going to tell you what they think, you really don't have to do that much work ahead of time. You can let them do, and it's not that hard to build, et cetera. Like the inputs of what the stakes are important. And then I remind people that sometimes the most expensive way to find out whether something works is to build it and see. Like if it doesn't work and you've got the wrong problem, you can spend a lot of money to find that out, or you can actually just go ask people on the cheap. Book recommendation, outcomes over output. I have something like 4 copies of this lying around the house, and that is for a reason. And the whole point of all of this, to get your product owners and your stakeholders to step out of what are we building, how quickly, how, tell me about the technology, tell me about the burn down, and actually thinking about what the outcomes they are generating are. At a product level, you have delivery hurdles and the hurdles of just sort of getting us heard, or when you're in the heat of delivery, how do you get through, this is what I'm supposed to do? Again, how do we know we did a good job? Who's grading our paper and how is it being graded? I love talking about, or I love breaking down conversations where you're stuck using the framework of positions versus interests. So instead of we should do this, or this is important, or this is the best way to go, to take one step back and say, here's what interest this serves. Here's why we do this. Here's what we think is, the important thing that is generated by doing this. And I find that invites a lot of really, really good conversation. Agilists, Scrum Masters, a lot of product owners, they get hung up on the difference between an activity and an artifact. So you'll end up with stories sometimes that are like, make a persona, make a wireframe, and basically they're asking you to deliver them the artifact, but they don't really incorporate the idea of the activity. Go talk to someone, do interviews, do a test, do whatever it is that you're going to do as the learning activity, that feeds the artifact. So I recommend being very careful and deliberate about talking about what the activity is versus what the artifact is. So, as designers, we don't want to say, hey, it's our job to make a persona. It's our job to make a journey map. It's our job to understand why people are doing what they're doing, what their attitudes and behaviors and expectations are. Those get captured in these kinds of artifacts, but you can't learn them without doing the activity. And then we talk a lot about our methodologies, but I really also recommend going to purpose. This is something that's been popping up for me a lot lately again, which is, instead of talking about the journey map or the here's what we're doing to learn something, the card sort or the test, as you evaluate your product, when you're thinking a little bit more holistically, when does a person become aware of you? What does their arrival look like? What is their wayfinding and their orientation and their decision support? Like, these terms tend to change the way people think, and they're in some ways kind of basic to us, but it's important to remember to return to them even when you are in your sprint, writing your stories, doing your day-to-day work. These are the pillars that actually help bring people back into the kinds of conversation that we want to have. So finally, how does this all come together? Like, what will make Agile a more human-centered Agile? And the first is, where I talked about, you hand off stewardship of a challenge. At every step, process-wise, you want to make sure that there is a needs analysis, a share out that is almost like a synthesis share out from your researcher, because that is effectively what it is. You're explaining to the next team, this is what we were trying to accomplish. This is why we think it's important. This is how we learned what we learned. This is how we got where we got. Now it's your turn. You get the baton and you get to figure out, did we get it right on the problem? Did we get it right on the solution? And then how do you actually do it right? Every team, once you start scaling up, once you're past that one team, hey, I was a happy Rocky guy, you're going to start needing a research roadmap. And the research roadmap accomplishes a few things. It shifts discussions from the activity that everyone on a team says should happen to the purpose of that activity and to a more holistic program or portfolio level view of what's important. Actually, yeah, I'm sorry. I had these built out as other slides and then I just went talking right past them. On that needs analysis share out, at the beginning, I recommend that they be workshops, that they bring in a lot of voices. As you move along, they can be more like a huddle, or teams may still need a workshop. That it's not just, and this is really important, it's not just at a kickoff or at a discovery step. These needs analysis steps need to actually keep happening. They loop a little bit and they get shorter, especially if there are individuals that are involved fully along the way. But they keep everyone sort of aligned. What I say here, I'm sorry I skipped over it because it's really important, is once you start handing things off, once you say, you're delivering my solution rather than taking over my challenge, you have started reproducing waterfall thinking already. Someone did the requirements, someone else is meant to build the actual thing. No matter how good your intentions are, you've just remade a little bit of waterfall. And it will, especially as you scale up further and further, it will come to bite you. A research roadmap means that your overall research time and support are becoming responsive to program level needs. It means that you can have open conversations about what the stakes are of each sort of effort and why it's important. And a formal ceremony, like making a research roadmap ceremony the way that you have other roadmap ceremonies, it has a function where HCD sort of has a place where they already need to come together in a way that doesn't happen elsewhere. So there's better information, there's better collaboration. The extra one weird trick of this is that if you can get product owners competing over research resources, you are also validating to anyone looking that research is important. So, you have 6 product managers, 3 of them are competing for the research resources. The other 3 start thinking, oh, this maybe I should be competing for this too. I've seen it happen a few times. It's a really kind of neat thing. Like the buy-in sort of happens logarithmically instead of linearly, exponentially. I think that's what the word I was fishing for. And finally, defining what you're doing. So this is an old saw, culture eats strategy for breakfast. But if you're not actually measuring your outcomes in a way that is not just delivery minded, it's not just burn down, you're gonna end up losing all of the house of cards that we're building here, or maybe house of wood, where we're that little pig in this story at the moment, is all going to come crashing down, because culture is going to win. So if culture is we get it out the door as fast as possible, then we ask questions about whether it was a good idea. Sometimes I like to say, yes, this is so important that it's too important for us to think about. If you can't get past that unless you actually get the culture right. And that requires outcome measurement, not just your burn down. It doesn't really do anyone any good to build a terrible thing just a little bit faster. It just doesn't, and we have to make that case. All right, give me 1 second, because, oops. Oh, auditing. This is just a process that I've started to build in more and more. I talk about, I listed those ingredients for design success, and we are coming to the end, so I think I'm going to hit my hour almost on the spot. Which of those ingredients are important? That are important were in place. Where did the designers get introduced into the workflow? Which phases of design did they have access to? And as you went, were there changes that, to either of these things that impacted what you ended up doing? So at an organization level, you really should be looking, this product, this team, they integrated with design this way, and this is what happened. That team integrated with design that way, and that's what happened. And you start being able to tell and see the story of what design is actually doing. I've lorem ipsum'd out some of the actual client details here, but this is what this looked like when I did it. I had one engagement where we basically were told, here's the step that you can step in on, here's how much time you have, you get to do this with your team, but all of the other ingredients of success were missing. And we talk about what came out of that. This is the same project and product owner on a different engagement, where we had a very different, oh shoot, I should have lorem ipsum that out, and I didn't. Sorry about that. I'm going to fix that before we send the deck out. But you'll see that it basically is the same kind of map for what kind of ingredients did we have, where were we engaged in the process, and then what happened when we were done. And being able to sort of repeatedly tell this kind of story gives you a platform to say, this is why it matters. This is why we're doing what we're doing. All right. That's it. That's my talk.